Imagine if a generation of young people all were measuring how every day they were loving God and loving people.
I think one metric we should always pay attention to is a fully staffed volunteer team with healthy, quality volunteers.
Hey y'all, welcome back to the Rethinking Youth Ministry podcast. My name is Leslie. I'm on the team here at Orange, and I'm excited for today's conversation because we are talking all about rethinking how you measure success in youth ministry.
Yeah.
Okay, today I'm in the studio with some incredible people. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I've got Shane, I've got Caitlin, I've got Sojo. Wait, are you going by Sojo or Joseph?
Sojo. Let's go
Okay,
Sojo.
you're Sojo
You introduce
today.
me Sojo, I'm Sojo. Let's go.
I love it. All right,
most
y'all,
people.
introduce yourselves. We'll start with Shane.
Okay, hey, I'm Shane. I'm part of the Orange Students team. I'm the director of Orange Students Project Strategy. Been in youth ministry for a minute, youth pastor at a couple places,
A
and
long
I'm excited
minute.
for this conversation.
Yeah, 15 years, something like that.
Yeah, we don't, just
I
calm
love
down.
it.
Let's calm down.
Okay,
yeah, that's
we'll
true,
keep
though.
going.
Yeah.
Caitlin, what's up?
Hey, I'm a student pastor. Absolutely love student ministry. Been in it from leading to being a pastor for about 9 years now. So love all
Yes.
things student ministry.
Fantastic.
awesome.
Thanks for being here. And Sojo.
Yeah, I started as a volunteer many years ago. Did that for about 4 years before I got to work with small groups, and then a youth pastor for a good amount of time. And then spent some time actually working with youth ministers all across the nation and kind of helping them kind of plan out their programs. So it was great.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
All right. Well, y'all are the right people for this conversation. We're talking about measuring like youth ministry success. We're talking about metrics that youth pastors maybe are trying to meet within their ministries. The place I want to start this conversation is I am curious to know, in your years in ministry, did you ever have metrics that you were like trying to hit? Like, did someone sit you down and say, here's the numbers or whatever the things are? I want to hear your experiences. I have never been a youth pastor who had metrics. And so, yeah, I'm curious. What's that
I
experience?
inherited metrics. Like I came behind a really great youth pastor in Atlanta, and he had a booming ministry, which is terrible. No one wants that, right? And so, but no, I came in. He was very thorough in his metrics, and so I remember just reviewing them and feeling the weight of that, and thinking, I don't know. There's going to be a season of shifting with my style. I was very different than him. He was so different than I was. And so there was a dip. And I remember beating myself up about that dip in that season before we ended up having some really great growth. But that season of dip was me getting in my head because I could not unsee his departures metrics. And so, and then obviously that ended up becoming my silent goal.
Yeah.
So-
Wait, so these are like attendance metrics specifically?
Attendance metrics, yeah,
Okay.
totally.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm curious, what other metrics have you guys experienced?
I mean, I've definitely experienced the same thing of metrics being like the number, like there's an expectation of this many students are coming on a Sunday night and are involved in the extras that you do.
Yeah.
And I think there's some metrics we put on ourselves of like how we're personally discipling students and how many we're showing up in their lives and like how many we know them by name and we know what's going on behind the scenes and stuff. So we put those own personal metrics in there too, I think.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And then you feel horrible when somebody memorizes everyone's name and you can't remember 12.
Yes.
I always beat
That's
myself
real.
up.
That's real. What about you, Shane?
Yeah, I feel like the silent metrics thing that Sojo just mentioned is really important. So for me, metrics look different throughout my local youth pastor days, but I remember at a church that I served at in Arizona, we were in a really difficult time, and metrics were all over the place. But I sat at the leadership team table for the church.
Yeah.
And so strategic initiatives and key performance indicators were in front of me all the time.
Yeah.
And I carried that weight of like, I have a responsibility within this youth ministry to make sure that we're moving the needle forward for the entire church.
Yeah.
And that was always like, it was never spoken or like, hey, you need to do this in youth ministry.
Yeah.
But I still like, it was that silent pressure I carried.
Interesting. Okay. So I hear all of y'all have been in ministry for some time. Did you ever have or hold a position where you got to set metrics for someone else?
Yeah, I mean, I got to set it for my, we call them group directors, but it was the person that was over small groups. And it was how many, the first metric we set was how many lunches or coffees, we would say coffees. How many coffees are you having with our small group leaders in a month? So how many touch points are you having? If you have 10 leaders, did you get to everyone twice in a month? That will be a pretty good goal. And then it was, the impact of how many kids are in groups And I mean, I hate to say, because we would go all the way down to regions and neighborhoods, but it's like, if I had a lot of kids in this area, but no kids on the east side, it's like, well, we want to put a little more effort and focus into where we want to make sure we're reaching kids.
So like acquiring kids to
like where they're coming from. And so sometimes I would even beat myself up, or I would say maybe put pressure on the group director of saying, hey, what do you think we need? What do the students look like on the east side of town, and what are we missing? What we're saying is not resonating, and so what could we learn?
I was a youth pastor in Sojo, same context, at a different campus years after him, and so we had a lot of those same metrics in that space. One of the things I think I would add is for our staff team, we wanted to make sure that we had fully staffed volunteer teams.
Gotcha.
So they were kind of held accountable to like, hey, we need this many volunteers in order to function well as a ministry.
Who was recruiting those volunteers? Who was held accountable to those numbers?
Groups directors.
Gotcha.
So we had a role that was specifically overseeing our volunteer group leaders. But in Arizona, a different context in which I led, our small group leaders had metrics for success. So we actually created some measures for small group leaders that coaches would then review with them on a quarterly basis to check in on how they were doing leading their groups.
Yeah, I mean, similar to Sojo, like with the people who are on the student team, making sure that they're meeting with their leaders consistently. So for us, we use like a spreadsheet of where's the date you're set up to meet with them? Do you meet with them? Check it off. Like schedule the next one, like in the next season, that kind of thing. So setting those metrics and expectations of you're meeting with your small group leaders, checking in, and it's trickling down.
Makes sense. Okay, so I'm curious to know, what are some ways that metrics are actually helpful in student ministry and youth ministry? What are some reasons maybe metrics are a good idea?
I'm going to piggyback off of Shane's, because literally we got a chance to implement a conversation guide, is what we called it, for small group leaders with their students. It was a rough template, and it was like 2 minutes or 5 minutes connecting with your guys or girls, and then breaking down the lesson. But it ended up being a really good guide of saying, we talked about open-ended discussions and asking questions that allow people to just give a one-word answer. We talked about that a lot at Orange. And so kind of guiding them to say a rich discussion should last more than one word answer. A rich discussion looks like you're able to open them up and get to talking maybe a minute, for a quiet kid, 30 seconds. For a talkative kid, making sure that they're limited and they're mindful of it. So we began to kind of set parameters so that small group leaders could walk out of a group and know, hey, that was a good discussion. Because a lot of times we were sitting with them and they were like, I don't know if I'm doing good when I get in there with my group. I just don't know. And we said, what can we give them to help them know that they're able to facilitate well?
That's good.
I think metrics help us know if things are going well. I think a lot of the time when you're in the moment, whether you've implemented something new or you're seeing out a program that's been in existence for a while, having a metric helps you look back and see, are we seeing success? Do we have consistency? Do we have growth? Like in a healthy way, metrics will help you know if your program is growing and healthy. And
Yeah, that makes sense.
I love having data-informed decisions. I think it's really, really important. So I was all about different types of metrics. So to answer your question, Leslie, I think that there are types of metrics that are really important. Metrics for small group leaders, how many times they're connecting with students. Do they know the names of every student on their roster? Like those seem so simple, but like, do they know them?
Right.
Do they understand certain things about them? Can they assess where they are on their journey in following Jesus? Like those types of things, which we would really actually measure with our small group leaders. But hear me out. I'm just going to go there.
Go there.
There's a metric. I've been changing a lot over the last few years. Okay. I just want to start there. This is not, this is
Is this a
not,
confession?
This is politics.
Not,
You're
no.
flip-flop.
Yeah,
What's happening?
I know. No, I feel like we're just, I'm going to get real. Okay.
Okay.
I've been wrestling with this one, but I'm not sure I've heard a great defense of the metric that most churches focus on most.
Oh yeah,
which
let's
is
talk
attendance.
about that. Yeah.
Like when you ask, are metrics important? That's the one that everybody points to. That's the one that everybody talks about. And I've had a hard time finding a good defense for it actually being important.
For sure. Well, that's kind of my next question is like, okay, we talked about some positive of metrics. It informs data, informs decisions. We have, comparative data. We can look back over different things and making clarity for our people who are actually trying to do the work, being able to measure, did I do what was asked of me? Now I want to ask, what are some harmful ways or ways that having metrics can be harmful to kind of the conversation of a spiritual development of kids or teenagers or of a ministry?
I think like Shane said, like the number metrics is really tricky, because if that's the only metric that you're using and measuring, and the only one that people see success coming from is if your numbers are growing, you're telling students that they're just a number.
Just a number.
And that, like, I think the measuring of metrics should turn more into, are students getting deeper in their faith? Are they learning about, like, we need to tweak our metrics where, sure, numbers in churches are super important and they have a place, but they can't be the only metric that we use. Like, that's where the negative side comes in.
Yeah.
So Caitlin, let me push that a little bit.
Okay.
Because I think that's the statement that I hear a lot, is that numbers in church matter a lot. They're important, but why?
That's great. Well, I've been asking myself that.
Okay. No,
I
that's
think
interesting.
For me personally, I get the higher ups of the church asking about numbers. So we're constantly told in measuring student ministry, like, where are your numbers growing? Or why aren't your numbers growing? So I think, like, that's a question I ask myself and I struggle with on a daily basis at the moment. So I think numbers are important from the context of, like, tithing and your church functioning and, like, meeting people in the community who need to know Jesus. So numbers in that aspect are super important, because you're seeing, like, people come in and come to know Christ or learn about him, wrestle with their questions, whatever it is. So I think those numbers are important. But I mean, I personally measure my success in student ministry a lot more about, are students growing in their faith? Or do they have a safe place to ask big questions? Do they have an adult who cares about them?
Yeah, I love that.
And if the answer to those is yes, then whether it's one student, 40 or 100, I see success no matter what that number is, personally.
That's good.
I'm gonna be the bad guy.
Please.
Be the bad guy.
I think attendance numbers are immensely important if you frame it the right way. I think that first let's just acknowledge the elephant in the room. If your numbers are steeply declining under new leadership, I think that everyone would at least review, like, let's put all ears there. Let's put some eyes on it and determine what that is. But that's like the easy one. I think when it comes to stagnated numbers, which I think a lot of ministries are facing, if you're doing the exact same quality that you did in the past, singing the same quality worship, preaching with the same sincerity, and you're still not growing, I think it speaks to a larger issue or a larger situation, which is the people have changed, right? I mean, I think what's difficult is when I run into youth pastors who are saying, I'm being pressured by my senior leadership and I'm doing everything. I'm busting my behind, but I'm not experiencing growth. And I would say, but that number should speak volumes, because now you're able to say they are busting their behind. They're hitting schools. They're doing all these things. They're doing everything the ministers of the past did, but they're not seeing the same results. That would show we're living in different times. I think the worst thing senior leadership could do is look at a number that's not changing, ignore the effort, and say that you're not able to make a fair deduction of saying, if they're doing all that and it's not changing, we have to open this up to a much larger conversation.
Yeah. Cool. I mean,
I got something to say.
Yeah. Go for it.
Okay. I think I haven't been in the situation where numbers decline steeply.
Yeah.
Steeply, is that a word?
Sure.
I don't know.
It is now. 24.
Where numbers decline, in a steep way. But as you say that, I think I wrestle with it, Sojo, because I'm not sure that it's always an indicator or reflection of that leader that is new or that is in that place. I actually think it can be a reflection of the leader who was before them, who may have built a ministry around themselves.
True. Absolutely.
And far too often, I mean, I know we come from a similar world.
Because
at one point we were in this, same church and stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's important the reason why I'm saying that is because we're coming from a context as one of the largest churches in the world, really. So we're not throwing like stones in any direction we've lived it. And I think the reason why this matters is that there are youth pastors who have followed leaders who are personality centric as their measure of success, and they come in and they try to do something a little bit different, and maybe numbers decline, maybe there's not as many kids that are on the fringes or showing up. But to Caitlin's point from earlier, students may be actually growing in their faith in an exponential way. Leaders may be healthier, culture may be better. So I don't want leaders to hear that if attendance numbers are up, down, anywhere in between, like that is their indication of success. Sometimes they grow, but sometimes they don't. I don't know that every healthy thing as far as church, as far as how we measure spiritual formation, necessarily grows in the way that we think of growth in our Western mindset, if that makes sense. Organizations grow.
Right.
Yep.
It really gets down to how we define success. If we're saying we're using these numbers to measure whether or not this ministry is successful, it's like, well, are we measuring the right thing to really get to whatever we're defining as success? If success is the room is full, great, then you need attendance numbers to hit that metric. But if success is our kids are growing spiritually, I mean, you maybe should measure something else. And so that's maybe my next question. What are some other things we maybe should start considering measuring, especially in light of how the world has changed?
100%.
People are attending church differently. Families are different.
Yeah.
Millennials are both leading and growing families. So how you're going to reach these millennials and Gen Z? Sorry, I said millennials. I meant Gen Z. I saw your face look so confused.
Oh, no, I was thinking
The millennial,
my bad.
middle
Millennial-
schoolers,
yes,
the millennial
the
middle
middle
schoolers,
schoolers.
powerful ministry.
The millennials and the Gen Z really are kind of the core younger families who are bringing youth to church these days. And so how has the world shifted, and how might we shift what we're measuring based on culture right now?
I think your touch point with them during the week matters. And I agree with what Shane said. I think with I'll say this. The only thing I would say with the steep decline is put eyes and ears on it. For me, when that decline happened, they were able to acknowledge that because I look different, because I talk different, because I am very different, there was some students that just didn't connect. But everything I was saying was good.
Yeah, that's good.
And so I think that once they put eyes and ears on me, they were able to say, yes, there's a decline in him, but it's just going to take a season of adjustment. And
That's
that
good.
season of adjustment, the trust that the church placed to me, it ended up being favorable. And so I'm grateful. I always tell people, like, put eyes, put ears on it. Absolutely. You want to do that if you see something that you want to say, let's just make sure that's making sense and there's nothing that's being said that's hurting people or too
that's
abrasive.
good. That's good.
But when it comes to what's your question? Because
Well, just that culture has changed. So
Yes.
how might we change to fit where culture is?
So, I mean, we used to measure on just Sundays and Wednesdays, and I think now we have to have a model that measures our engagement with students every single day. Social media makes it easy. Face-to-face, we know, goes a long way with students. If you're able to sit down with them, we know that means so much more to them. So how do you equate that kind of impact when you're able to say, I want to take time out of my busy schedule to meet with you? When you're sitting with them, what you're hearing from them is this new generation truly is impacted by that. And it means so much more due to it being a digital age.
Yeah, that's good.
I'll start with that.
That's good. To answer your question, Leslie, one of the first things we need to do is probably be honest about why we measure certain things. So what's ringing in my ears right now is something Caitlin said earlier of like, we measure for, there are financial things in the church. Like there are certain aspects about but let's just be like real about it. Like instead of gaslighting, instead of like calling it something to try to soften the blow, like let's just say, hey, a church that it runs like an organization needs money or it's not gonna keep going. And in order to raise money to keep this mission moving forward, we need people to be a part of it. I think Gen Z and Gen Alpha, if we're not honest, if we try to package that too much around vision or platitudes or rhetoric, they're gonna be like, that's whack, that feels off, kind of scammy, not for me. But I think if we're upfront about those things that we measure, and then we're strategic about measuring what maybe historically have felt like intangibles, things like spiritual formation, maybe centered around the spiritual practices and how often students are engaging in those habits. Fully staffed and healthy volunteer teams, I think, is another big metric. How many students are actually serving, not just in the church, but in your surrounding community on a regular basis? Like, those are some of the metrics that pop into my mind that I'm like, if we just be honest about, I'm not saying to stop measure these, but if we be honest about why we measure them and not make them the measure of success, but maybe just the measure of viability for our church, and we focus on these other things as measures of success, maybe it'll lead to greater health.
Yeah, I think a generation who values authenticity would love that level of transparency. And I think that level of transparency on the ministry's part really does, one, it checks your integrity to be like, if I have to show these numbers to this generation to see if they're going to keep coming and bringing their family, and if I have to be accountable for how we're spending, then maybe it does just breed more integrity. But I also think that a generation who feels like, oh, I get to participate in this being a part of my community are going to be even more open to participating in keeping the lights on and making the building open, buying into the programming happening, because they're like, oh, I see how all this works together. Like,
I think we have a generation right now in student ministry that wants ownership. They want people who are authentic leading them. And I think we have to change the way we look at metrics a little bit to fit with that, where we're not expecting like the same consistency out of them that we used to.
Yeah.
And we're just expecting, I think a metric that we could change a little bit is their involvement in stuff during the week. Like, are they like opening up their Bible? Like, I don't know, like we do midweek stuff. And so like measuring success on students, getting personal discipleship from leaders, one-on-one, two-on-one, whatever that looks like. Or if you YouVersion Bible app, if they're getting in there and doing one of those group studies together, I think a way to measure that, it's similar like the social media thing. You have a really easy metric right there to see, oh, I've got 10 students plugged into this and they're diving in and working through these scriptures together. I think that's a really simple thing where students can join. You're not asking them to do something extra or show up at something extra.
That's good.
I think that's another metric that we could look at shifting our judgment to.
Yeah, that's good.
That's great.
This is going to be too idealistic, but Caitlin, that sparked a thought for me. It'd be interesting if you could play the long game in youth ministry and you committed to a place for, a decade or something like that, to measure the youth ministry's impact on the surrounding community. So not just measure what's happening in your church or the students that are currently coming to it, but like, is the needle moving at all on like unhoused youth in your community? If there's a food crisis in some way, like, is your church actually having an impact on that? Like, it'd be interesting. And I guess maybe we've talked about this, I think, around
we
here.
talk
Like,
about
what is the census data actually potentially changing? As weird and different as that sounds, that could be a really cool indicator of a church, having success.
And I do think you hit on something that's important. Measuring numbers over time and comparing the whole picture, the long game really is what we're, in it for, is the long game. And so do we even have access to numbers from 5 or 10 years ago? I think that's an important thing, even figuring out how will you track what you're measuring? Where's that data being stored?
Yeah, that's good. That's
I
really
think,
good.
like, what's the time period that you're expecting success? Like, are you measuring whatever metric it is? Are you giving it a year? Are you giving it 5 years? Are you giving it 10 years? Like, how quickly do you deem if something is successful?
That's real. That's real.
I mean, if it's in the building, it's one thing. But let's just say you say something on stage on Sunday and then you post it online on Monday. You can't just neglect that impact as well, right? So it's like it really truly is. If your impact here isn't what it used to be, then I think to all the innovative pastors out there, they would think, okay, well, if I believe that there's more impact to be had, then it hopefully will inspire you to say, then let's find the different areas. And then you're right, it's more cumulative. It's a cumulative perspective as to, well, we're getting this many YouTube views. We've got this many TikTok views. We've got this many in-person views. And so I really think that in the end, we have to view it the way people are wired in today's culture. I know, like you said, the big one, churches are literally like, but if they're not in this building, in the end, we don't get tithe dollars. And we got to make sure that we pay people's benefits as well as keep lights on. And maybe we could do better at communicating that, because that is the tension. The other tension I would say is you're measuring based on the church down the road. And a lot of times if I was making a hoodie, I could grade myself based against Louis Vuitton and say Louis Vuitton hoodies are selling out and Urban Outfitters hoodies are selling here. But in the end, I got to know who am I trying to make this hoodie for? And maybe I'm only making 100, but if 100 people buy my 100 stock, that's a success. Unless I'm looking at Urban Outfitters, and then I feel like a failure. I think there's too many youth pastors that they're having a success, but they're looking at the church 2 counties over and saying, but they have that, so I must not be successful. And I'm like, hey, you are doing a great job.
That's so good.
Don't grade yourself against Urban Outfitters. Run your course. Maybe one day you may be urban. Who knows? But you got to stay the authenticity. You have to stay your course.
Maybe one day you'll be shopping at Louis Vuitton like Sojo. You know what I'm saying?
I've never bought one Louis Vuitton item.
Get out of here. You know what that makes me think though, Sojo, is there's a difference between measuring for impact, and you use that word impact, which I love. There's a difference between measuring for impact and measuring for ego. And I think sometimes, like if I'm honest, I've done it. I've done it.
I have too.
Like there have been plenty of times where the room is full and I've walked out and I have slept so well that night thinking I crushed it. I'm just such a good youth pastor, But if I stop for a second and go, what is the true impact? What is the lasting legacy impact of what's happening here? It can never go as far as it could go, by focusing on some of the intangibles or focusing 100%. On a team of leaders, as it would be if I was just focusing on the things that stroke my own ego, like attendance numbers, full rooms, and how many students post
Hands
about it online. You know what I mean?
Sense.
So yeah, ego or impact, I think, is important.
That's great.
All right, so we've talked about a lot of things. I know that a lot of times youth pastors can't necessarily set their own metrics. Sometimes they feel like they have to live up to metrics that have been set for them. I'm curious, what role do lead pastors or senior leadership teams have in the conversation around metrics? What are ways they can either make this easier or better on us, or what are some things you wish you could say to them?
I mean, I think the key is what you just said. I mean, I think capitalizing on that conversation is the main thing that it would be critical. I think when you're walking into a senior leadership meeting, your goal now should be to paint the holistic picture of youth today. And even in that, if you can get as much information on that region, your neighborhoods, and what's happening before you let them know the action steps. So with that said, we're going to do this for that. We're going to do this for that.
Yeah,
I think that allows them to feel some type of ownership. It's easy for senior pastors to think that youth pastors just aren't seeing the field. It's very frustrating. I think youth pastors do see the whole field. They do see all the complexities of today's generation. I honestly think senior leaders oftentimes are so busy with all the other things that they may be neglecting some of the nuances that youth ministers have to walk through. And so the more you could be able to paint that picture to them and say, and that's why we're doing this, and this to tackle this, and this. Do you all think that would be a strong choice or a strong plan? I think that allows them to have some buy-in on the front end. In my in my seasons of conflict with senior leadership, I wish I could have been done better letting them know my plan on the front end versus them just evaluating it on the back end.
Oh, that's good.
So walking in with a strategic plan, an informed strategic
sure.
plan. That's brilliant. Yeah.
I think senior leadership, even like, say your senior leadership sets an expectation of a certain metric, I think that making sure that they're aware that there are wins outside of that metric alone is super important. So yeah, maybe you're not meeting that metric right at that moment, but helping them understand that, yeah, we're working towards that. We're doing, like Sojo said, we're doing this to get there and all of that.
Yeah.
But also showing them at the same time, like, hey, we went to camp and 10 students accepted Christ, or this Sunday, this one student asked this huge pivotal faith question. It changed everything for them. Like helping senior leadership see that there are like huge wins behind the scenes.
It's like
good.
telling the story of all the things that are happening. That's fantastic. Yeah.
I think we have to give senior leaders the benefit of the doubt, and really in two ways. One is there's a chance that this is the only measure of success they've ever known, like certain attendance numbers and things like that, because that's what it was, for the generation ahead of us. But then two, they're being held accountable for metrics, whether that be by the board or I don't even know who else it would be, key stakeholders in the church. Oh. Well, God.
That's another podcast.
And I would say if they don't have accountability on any of that stuff, like I throw some red flags your way. Okay. It's 2024. We've learned, hopefully. But my point in saying that is like, I think you have to assume that they're doing their best and that they're probably, if you're feeling that pressure, they're feeling pressure somewhere as well. So to do what both Sojo and Caitlin have said, I think is important. And I think what I would add to it is in the opportunities you have to build trust with your senior leadership, make sure that you're crushing those. Because as you build trust, you'll be able to paint a clear picture of what really matters in youth ministry. And that's going to take some time, but that's just managing change. Like that's just leveraging influence in a healthy way. So I think you have to take that time to build trust. And then once you build trust, I've got an idea. I've got a friend who told me this. I did not get to try it. And it's bold and I think it's idealistic, but it was interesting to me. He asked me one time, this is while I was still a local church youth pastor, he said, what would it look like for you to go to your leadership and say, hey, for the next year, I am not going to submit any attendance numbers to you at all. I'm going to focus on XYZ, a strategic plan for like spiritual growth in the life of your students, church engagement, whatever else you want to fill in the blank there with. And then at the end of that year, I'm going to bring those results back to you. And then you can tell me whether or not you want to go back to measuring attendance. And I was like, that's bold. I'd love somebody to try it. I'm serious. Like I would somebody out there in 2024 in the current state of youth ministry probably has the potential to do that. I'd be so interested a year from now.
Good.
We'll have you on this podcast.
I'll
take my seat.
There it is.
DM us at Orange Students on Instagram.
let us
We'd
know.
love to hear from you.
Can I give you one controversial hack?
Ooh, yes.
Do it.
I think if your pastor, a lot of pastors start as youth pastors. if you can get some intel on their day,
On their metrics.
then
Well,
go
back
in
in
there
1998,
and
you
stroke
only
their
had-
ego, as Shane would say, and say, you know, I think what I loved about when you were leading is you did this. So when looking at that, I've been able to learn from it. I think we're going to do this. If you can tie it back to their day, they realize that not only did you look at today's history, you looked at the total history. So many pastors were youth pastors. The unspoken elephant in the room is, I did this before you did this. The question is, do I think you're doing it as good as I'm doing it? And I hate that ego comes into play, even when it comes to pastors, right? But a lot of times they are very familiar with youth ministry. And so really being able to say, I'm familiar with your time. And I love what you all did here, here, and here. And we're going to try to recapture that here. Oftentimes it lets them know, okay, so you're not just a change agent who doesn't care about things that I cared about.
Yeah, that's good. Or you go, listen, chill. You're not Billy Graham, so why are you trying to make me
You
weird,
only
you know?
had 6, okay? I checked the numbers. Your
Let's talk about
dashboard.
it.
Y'all are
No, don't do that. Don't do
Oh
that.
my
Don't do that.
gosh.
That's a terrible
Okay.
advice.
Oh, the
Be funny
thing-
though.
It would
Let us know.
be.
We'll have you a year
Stop.
from now.
Have you on our new
Because you'll be
for a
fine. You'll be looking
job.
for a job for sure. So.
Oh my gosh, that's wonderful. The thing I hear, what were you gonna
No,
say?
I'm not going to say anything. You're not kidding. Nope, you're not. Go.
The thing that I hear y'all saying though really is it's about showing up with data, showing up informed, and participating in how some of those numbers get set if possible, whether that's the storytelling
That's
of what's
good.
happening across your ministry.
Perfect.
Like not showing up, victim is a strong word, but not showing up as, you know, they're going to tell me these numbers. I know I'm not going to hit them, but how can you participate in setting the numbers together? Hopefully, if you are serving under a reasonable leader, they are willing to meet you at the table and do that with you.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's important. I'd love to hear y'all thoughts on this. There are certain situations
Yeah,
where reasonableness may not be in the equation.
I know.
And I think in the current state of the church, at least here in the West or in America, that's becoming uncovered. Like we're experiencing that more and more.
Yeah.
So that may be a very real thing too. And it's not
Yeah.
easy to just be like, we'll find that church. I know it's not that simple,
Yeah.
but you may have to evaluate reasonableness as well.
And that takes discernment. And I think when you sit, maybe that's talking to another youth pastor, a friend, or a mentor, and being able to say, I think I have some issues with this. And they may say, hey, if that's how you true, then your discernment, if that's how you feel, then your discernment is probably letting you know that this isn't the right
Oh,
fit.
that's good.
And I think that's very awkward. That's probably the most sensitive metric
Yep.
of all, is your own internal Holy Spirit kind of nudging you as to where you need to be moving and where you best align.
Wow.
And so, yeah, I think always being conscious of feeding yourself, make sure you're at full so that you're able to really see that clearly is so imperative in
that's
today's crazy
Yeah.
world.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
good.
So
Something you said kind of sparked an interesting thought. Again, easy for me to say I'm on a podcast and I am not leading a ministry,
Yeah.
but just the idea of getting with other youth pastors.
Yeah.
What if there was a way that we had metrics that were metrics of our whole county or region, and we are doing shared metrics
love
with
that
other
idea.
youth pastors to say, this is the percentage of teenagers in our region. This is the percentage of them attending somewhere or showing up to some programming. Like, is there a way to have shared metrics that
they
help
will lie.
pa-
You know them other pastors lie. They all
They are
liars
gonna
down
lie.
the road.
Stop.
I was thinking like people with my personality will make it competitive.
Oh no,
And so I'm gonna bring.
that's not where I was
Come
going.
on, man! I'm
Come on.
LeBron with the
Come on.
Cavs here.
Come on.
I'm
You see
carrying
these
oil
numbers.
on my
You
back.
see these
Oh my
numbers.
Step it up,
gosh.
right?
Okay, maybe it
It's
doesn't need to
beautiful.
be.
It's
It's
beautiful.
idealistic,
No,
but maybe
it
it doesn't
is.
need to be
I love it.
attendance. Maybe it's even this is how often we're serving with other ministries
Yeah.
in X amount of spaces for X amount of
Oh, I
time.
love
Maybe it's
that.
hours of service across the county. I don't know what it is, but maybe
Imagine
there's shared
imagine the picture of impact you'd
Right?
see in your true community.
Yeah.
If all the churches were able to say, this is what we're doing, this is what we're doing, this is what we're, and then you truly be able to see, this is what we are doing.
Yeah.
That's so good.
That'd be beautiful.
That'd be cool.
When as a collective whole of a church, like we should be doing that and celebrating the fact that
Yeah.
hey, this many students in our community are engaged and serving and
Yeah.
following Christ. Like that should be a celebration as
Yeah,
opposed
that's
to
so
being
cool.
like, man, this
Yeah.
church across the street has 1,000 more kids than
Right.
I do, so
Right.
like I'm not succeeding. Like
Yeah.
we should be celebrating the fact that there are 40 kids at this church and 5 at this and 1,000 at this that are all coming to know Jesus.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah.
I
And
love
that
that.
you don't have to buy 1,000 soft tacos from Taco Bell. You
yeah.
don't have to do that.
That's
Oh,
fantastic. All right, we are bringing this conversation in for a landing, but before we go, I have one final question. I know it can be hard to sit through a conversation like this where you're like, at the end, you're still like, I'm still not meeting that one metric that is like hanging over my head. Well, I want to kind of pivot it and say, where's another place we can measure and get a win? Like, what is one non-negotiable that maybe we should all be measuring that will maybe always be timeless or relevant? Yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on that. I'm going with Shane first.
Okay, thanks. It's easy. I think one metric we should always pay attention to is a fully staffed volunteer team with healthy, quality volunteers. That could be one volunteer, depending on your setting, or it could be 100 volunteers. But I think if we are focused that way, it does a couple of things. One, it makes sure that the students that we're caring for are being shepherded beyond our capacity as an individual, because we can't necessarily do it all, especially if we need another volunteer in that space. And then two, it makes sure that our youth ministry's spiritual formation and growth is not just dependent on us as a leader. We're spreading our leadership, we're multiplying our leadership and carrying that together with other people. So that's what I say. It could be, the contexts are all different, but whatever that looks like in your context, I think it's important.
So like being able to measure how much success your ministry can have even without you being the person
1000%.
in every conversation.
Yeah. Well, and the key indicator of that will be when you leave someday, because you most likely will, the ministry continues moving in health and, what we've now defined as success beyond your leadership.
That's awesome. That's great.
I think a metric that should be measured is student serving, whether it's in different areas of the church or if it's outside the church, but measuring that metric, because if we're doing our job well in shepherding and teaching students about Jesus, then being the hands and the feet of Christ is a natural byproduct. So I think that's a really important metric for us to measure, and I think it's a good place for us to get a win.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, Joe?
I'd say imagine if a generation of young people all were measuring how every day they were loving God and loving people. And if we were able to hear from them and learn their way of loving God and their way of loving people, imagine what we would continue to learn as a church. So I think that's one that would be pretty beautiful to see.
I love that idea of getting the evidence and the stories from their lives. That is incredible. That's incredible. Well, thank you so much for tuning into this conversation where we've been talking about how to measure success in youth ministry. We love rethinking with you. And so we want to know what you've been rethinking when it comes to measuring success in your ministry. You can always DM us at Orange Students on Instagram, and we will talk to you next time.